So this section I've entitled Healing and Hope. And here I want to take you into some of the secular ideas, the research that has come out of two particular people. John Gottman is one of them, and he's written some very well-known books, Why Marriages Succeed or Fail, a very recent, much more recent book, The Science of Trust. And then Sue Johnson, before I get to her later on. So that picture there is of John Gottman and his wife, who both speak on this topic. A book from Christians for pastors particularly, and for counsellors, Counselling Couples in Conflict by James Sells and Mark Yarhouse is a very useful book. And I'll come back to Sue Johnson at the end. What the Gottmans did in their research, which has been going on for many years now, was basically ask the question, what makes marriages succeed or fail? And what makes love last? Now, they weren't distinguishing between Christians and non-Christians here, but they took couples and they put them in a 3-hour assessment where they videotaped them in discussions. They measured their heart rate, their blood pressure, they watched their facial expressions, etc. And they found that they could predict with 90% accuracy, after just a very short time of watching them on video, something like 5 or 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, they could predict with 90% accuracy who would break up, which marriages would fail, and who would stay together. And this is across cultures. Okay, now there are lots of differences in marriage in different cultures, but they've done this in a number of cultures. And one of the things they say is that conflict in marriage is not a bad thing. You're two individual people. You have a right to have differences, but how you deal with your difference is the critical thing, of course. Now, they divide people up. They categorize them as masters and disasters. Okay? And so that the quality, we'll look at the qualities of each. So remember that slide on love in 1 Corinthians 13. The masters in marriage who do a good job are gentle and kind. They admit mistakes. They take responsibility. They build appreciation and respect. They show gratitude. They listen well. They have humor and affection. And they know how to soothe themselves and to soothe their partner. That's a pretty good parallel, isn't it, with 1 Corinthians 13 there. Now, the masters, therefore, are very gentle with each other in disagreements. They know how to have what they call soft startups. Rather than just getting furious with your spouse immediately and yelling at them, you gently approach a difference. Especially women learning to have soft startups. They have frequent thoughts about the positive aspects of their spouse and minimize their focus on the negative aspects. Now, when a marriage begins to go downhill, you see that usually spinning the other way. All you can think about is the negative things about this person. So there's a certain discipline in making yourself remember the positives when things are difficult. Masters avoid contempt, and that's a critical one we'll come back to. They know how to soothe and change the subject to distract from some of the painful things in a kind and gentle way. Now, it's been found that men tend to, when there is conflict, tend to be more physiologically aroused. Their heart goes up faster, their blood pressure goes up faster, and men tend, therefore, to, probably because they're tempted more to fight, physically react that way, they're built more for that, they tend to either fight or flee, or they freeze, which is, of course, the escape mechanism. I don't know what to do here, I'm a deer caught in the headlights. So none of those reactions are particularly helpful in a relationship. But the physiological arousal makes that more likely to happen with men. So when you get to the disasters, they are the four things that he calls, well, I'll get to, there are four things that stand out: criticism, defensiveness and blaming, contempt, and stonewalling, as he calls it, which is the withdrawing. And they call this the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Okay? And once these four horsemen enter a marriage, then there's a real danger that you're beginning to go downhill. Now, most good marriages have times of where the four horsemen invade your household for a while, and part of the task is to push them out again, or get a therapist or a counselor or a pastor to help you do that. So looking at each of these in a bit more detail, with criticism and defensiveness and blaming first. The pattern of escalation of conflict into these four horsemen predicted, if this was a pattern that they saw in these recorded interviews, predicted divorce 5.5 years after marriage. Now we know that the 5 to 8 year window is a pretty tense one. They're often young children. You know, you've got over the initial phases of marriage, and now that is a typically difficult time. And the couples who are going downhill into these tend, as I said, to interpret everything negatively. They ignore the positive. So criticism is attacking someone's personality or character rather than talking about a specific behavior, usually with blame. Criticism usually comes with a harsh startup. Now, airing a complaint or a difference or a desire is obviously, if it's done properly, it's a good thing. Pete Scazzero, a pastor in New York City, I was hearing him speak just the other day, and he trains his whole church in communication skills of how not to be contemptuous and critical. He doesn't just do it with couples. The whole church goes through these exercises. And one of the exercises is when you have a difference with someone, you say, I have noticed that this is what you do every time I try to talk to you about this problem. You know, I would really prefer it if you would stop and look me in the eye and that we could have a proper conversation. So it's the language of, I've noticed, I would prefer, which is not an attacking. It is a complaint in a sense, but it's not an attack. It's not contemptuous. It's a more constructive way, and I think couples need that help. Godman says that the first 3 minutes of a conflict, when we're watching a conflict on video, predict what the relationship will be like 5 years later. That's the pattern that they're in. So the defensiveness, of course, is you both feel that the other person is blaming you. It's always my fault. She never says sorry. She always makes me feel it's my fault. And of course, she feels exactly the same. You meet criticism with criticism. You make excuses. People repeat themselves. And I think especially, as I said earlier, for if people are ashamed, we feel other people attacking us, we tend to want to shame them back, to get revenge. It's a gut response, reflex, when we're shamed. And taking responsibility, it defuses a fight, doesn't it? I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you in this way, and I'm so sorry that I did. And I take responsibility for doing that. Please, will you forgive me? And to be able to name the harm and the damage that you have done. And usually then that opens the door for the other person to take responsibility for themselves. And I think the Gottmans noticed that women often are more reluctant than men to take responsibility first. And the men often feel more targeted as the cause of the problems. Now, contempt is the sort of next layer, isn't it, from criticism. Contempt is where you have the intention to insult and psychologically abuse. You act from a superior attitude. You insult, you call names, you mock, you use hostile humor. Your body language is sneering. How could you do that to me? That is disgusting. You are always so late when we want to go out anywhere. You always, those are contempt, aren't they? Contempt is a very onomatopoeic word. It carries the disgust in its the way you say it, contempt. You want to spit about this person. And when people live in the shadow of a contemptuous other person, they get sick more. There's more illness, their immune system is undermined. And contempt involves criticism of character rather than actions. You're always lazy. You're such an idiot. You're crazy. You're stupid. And the disasters tend to be scanning for mistakes. They're looking for mistakes, noticing those. They're irritable and annoyed all the time. The masters are scanning for what is right, what is good, and they express appreciation. Now, in our culture, we tend to think that we tend to train people to be critical thinkers, don't we? There's something about critical thinking that is valued, to be discerning and critical. If you're an educated person, you're critical and cynical about life. It's dangerous if you take that over into your marriage. Then the last one, withdrawal and stonewalling, is here, and you're trying to be neutral and not make things worse, or you are escape from the tension. So you might have good intentions. I don't want to inflame this, or it might be a means of passive aggression. I'm not going to talk to you about this. And you get back at the other person by refusing to engage. Men often tend to retreat, as I said earlier, into their cave, and women tend to pursue them, trying to draw them out. That may not be a good idea for women to do that, because then he's cornered in his cave, and he may come out like a bear, fighting. So it's sort of like men say, I always make it worse if I open my mouth, so I'm going to wait for the storm to blow over and die down. Now that may be a good idea. I mean, obviously, when you're in fights, we have to teach folk who are in marriage conflict to take time out. When your pulse rate goes above 100, stop. When you start saying contemptuous words or thinking contemptuous thoughts, stop. Take a break. Come back to this in half an hour, or later on in the evening if this is something you really need to talk about. Or don't. I often say to couples, I don't want you to talk about these difficult things except in this room with me, when it's really inflammatory. And then you're, in a sense, you're teaching them the art of better communication. And then, so the stonewalling, those are the four there. Now, John Gottman says there is this magic ratio that in a marriage, and I think it applies to all relationships, that you need, for every one negative comment, you need at least 5 positives. And once a marriage is going downhill, the ratio begins to descend to 4-to-1, 3-to-1, 2-to-1, 1-to-1, and then it's all negative. So once it goes below 5-to-1, the chances of it breaking up are bad. Then they talk a lot about the importance of nurturing friendship and intimacy. And this means you need to get to know your partner's world. You need to have a curiosity. That wonderful sort of enchantment that you had when you were falling in love and engaged, and you wanted to sit and talk for hours and find out about each other. Once you're married and you have little children or even bigger children, you tend not to do that. You assume you know. My wife and I make it a point of sort of spiritual discipline to, at the end of the day when we meet after work, to ask each other about how was the day for you. And it may be very dull and boring. Well, okay, that's okay, let's hear about that. It may be very exciting, something that's happened, but to be interested in the other person's life, to have a curiosity and an empathy for how they are feeling, rather than thinking, I get home, I want my food, I want to sit down in front of the television, I want my beer or glass of wine, rather than cultivating the intimacy and the friendship. And I think cultivating, common interests is incredibly important. My wife and I love exercising together, walking, running, Pilates. We love bird watching. We love sailing. Thankfully, we have interests. Now, there are many couples who have difficulty with finding common interests, and many couples for whom one is physically much less able than the other. But working at those common interests, I think, is important. Building love maps, understanding your spouse's story and what attachment means to them. What was their early childhood relationship like with their parents? What was their parents' relationship like? Hopefully, premarital counseling goes into that, and you explore some of that with the couple. And I think part of this is learning the things and the places that you each like. Understanding each other's dreams and hopes and aspirations. And that will change over time at different phases of life. This is, and the fondness and admiration system is basically saying thank you, and often saying, I love you, and I really love what you're wearing today, and you look beautiful, and thank you so much for that wonderful meal that you cooked, or for writing that letter to our kids when I didn't have time, or whatever it is. It's this active gratitude, the discipline of gratitude. And we've discovered in positive psychology, as it's called, that that's an incredibly important healing thing in any broken relationship. Taking the time to touch physically, and not necessarily, wives often say, whenever he touches me, I know he wants sex. That's a big turn-off. But if they know that you are just touching them, just an arm around their shoulders, a quick hug, a kiss, all of this is the sort of the bonding part of the relationship, which enables you at particular times then to have a good sex life. But there are some people who say you need to hug for at least 3 minutes a day. You need to kiss for at least 10 seconds. A 10-second kiss for once a day, and maybe a few others as well. You need to touch at night. You need to hug. And this is, I think, as we know, the differences between men and women. This is more important for women than men. And as men get older, as I have discovered, they're able to enjoy the cuddles and the affection without the sort of pressure for, let's go on, let's have intercourse together. So respecting the differences there is incredibly important. Creating shared meaning with rituals, with holidays, with celebrations. The Godmans really are, these are their headings, and I'm filling in some of the detail here. Then in managing conflict constructively, they say that in all marriages there are major areas of disagreement, and that 69% of the time conflicts come over unresolvable issues. Now, we always have this romantic idea that Christian marriages shouldn't have differences and shouldn't have unresolvable issues. But maybe there are some, and there certainly are in my marriage, things that have always caused tension between us because of our different ways of looking at it. But it's how you manage those that is so critical. Can you agree to disagree rather than forcing the other person? And it's important, the Godmans say, for men to accept influence from women, because we tend to overpower maybe by our strength of voice or strength of body or whatever it is. You have to develop, they say, shared humor and affection around these tough issues. To be able to laugh together is incredibly important over conflict and difficult things. Building trust. Are you both trustworthy? And they talk about the fact that when they ask people, do you love your spouse? People usually say, of course I do. Do you trust your spouse? Well, let me think about that for a minute. That's a little more difficult because there have been, in most marriages, times of betrayal. Whether it's sexual betrayal into pornography or an affair, or whether it's financial betrayal, all sorts of things get in the way. So trust is really important because we want to know that there is someone there who will catch me if I fall. When I am weak, when I am depressed, time of depression that I went through, I was so glad that my wife was able to care for me and encourage me in that. And when she has been down and struggling with work issues, that she should know that I am there for her. It's a very basic relational task that we learn very early, isn't it? And a lot of the people who come to us with marriage problems have very poor examples and have not been well attached to trustworthy people in their childhood. That makes it much more difficult in your marriage. Now, the final bit here is Sue Johnson with her marriage research, which she's written in a book called Hold Me Tight, and a more recent book called Love Sense. This is emotionally focused therapy. We teach our students at the seminary this because it is it's complex when it's done really well, but it's fairly simple to teach and to learn, and it has such strong connections with a Christian view. Although she is a humanist, she is a very caring and very sensitive person in human relationships. This is part of what I would call common grace wisdom. The basic focus in her work is we're made for connection and deep attachment. You can't go far wrong with that, can you? I mean, we're made in the image of God for relationship, made for connection and deep attachment. And she goes through various stages, which I'll just mention quickly here. But the first is defining what she calls the demon dialogues or defensive dances. So she calls one the protest polka, where one partner is always demanding and the other person is always withdrawing. Or another one is find the bad guy. So one person is always blaming, or you're each blaming each other, always making the other person the bad guy. So that once you have built a relationship with the couple, you've heard what their struggles are, then you begin to work with them to define these demon dialogues. Because most couples get into cycles, and they go through the same pattern again and again. You probably see it in your own marriages. And so usually we say to people, well, after you've been through the initial interviews of getting to know them, next week I want you to come back and I want you to tell me one incident this week where you had conflict. And let's just talk about that one incident. And in that incident, you will find that demon dialogue. And then so you help them to see the pattern. Now, you're not blaming one or the other. You're looking for what happens between them. Okay? That's a very important thing. And you're helping them to name the cycle and to recognize and put words to their own and their spouse's emotions. So most couples get into conflict and they're not actually talking about what's under the surface. They're just dealing with the surface issue. What they really need to talk about is what's below the surface. What's the fear? What's the longing under the surface that is not, that the fear that you're trying to avoid? What's making you feel ashamed? So the softer emotions under anger, like guilt and shame, inferiority, fear, pain, memories of traumatic past incidents. So you enable them to say to each other, when my spouse, when my wife or my husband does this, I feel this. When have I felt that before in my life? And here you're taking them back into their attachment history in early life. And how did I react then? I find that when I'm angry, I get afraid and panicky. And then I lash out or I retreat. I get withdrawn when I feel intimidated and incompetent and helpless. That's the stuff below the surface, isn't it? That people don't usually take the time. So you're slowing the whole process down and unwrapping, expanding the emotions. And the therapist does a lot of reflecting back in a sort of Rogerian style, but putting it in other words and amplifying it and almost exaggerating it so that they see it more clearly. Then they would name and revisit what they call the raw spots, what I've called the wounds we often talk about. What are the raw spots in your marriage which keep coming up? That time when your husband went away on a business trip and he didn't call you once during that week when he was away, and you felt deeply hurt and betrayed by him. That time when you went to hospital to have the baby and he was too busy at work and he didn't make the time to get away and come until he arrived an hour after you'd had the baby. You've never talked about it before, but it's there. It's a sense of betrayal. And then helping them to take responsibility and to say, I'm so sorry. I never realized how much I hurt you by that action. And then behind this, as I mentioned, I was putting words to fears and longings. Because all of us have deep fears and anxieties that rule our lives, or tend to, and we also have deep longings. I long for my wife to be able to affirm me more. I long for her respect. I'm afraid that she always notices the things that I do wrong and never notices the things that I do right. May have never verbalized that. So putting these fears into words and longings in a safe environment, so the counsellor has to create that trust, that relationship. This isn't something you do over just a few weeks. This may be over 20 weeks. Here we're getting into professional marriage therapy. And then, interestingly, she goes on, has a chapter in her book on forgiveness, which for us obviously is an incredibly important part of all relationships, of mutual repentance and forgiveness. And she, just as I would have often taught on this topic, is that there's a lot of light forgiveness that people, so to actually ask, to be truly repentant and ask forgiveness is to name the damage that you have done, to name the hurt that you have caused, and to say, please will you forgive me? I know that this was the effect of what I did. Most of it just say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. You're making an excuse. You're running away from really deep repentance and forgiveness. Learning to delight in and to forgive your spouse. We've talked about that earlier, I think, what it means to delight in. So that marriage finally becomes a secure base, this is her language, and a safe haven for both of you. A secure base and a safe haven for you both to go out into the world. No longer are you facing each other with swords drawn against each other like enemies. Now you are, in Dan Allender's words, intimate allies you are standing back to back and side by side with your swords drawn towards the world and the flesh and the devil. So I think there is a danger, as I finish here, of idolatry of marriage, in the sense that if my marriage is fine, no, let me put it another way. If I expect all my needs in my life for love and affection and affirmation and satisfaction to be met in my marriage, you will be bitterly disappointed. If you are a perfectionist who expects your spouse to be perfect, you will, as Mrs. Schaefer used to say, if you expect perfection, you'll end up with nothing. You will destroy your marriage. And I think that the calling here, and this passage from Ecclesiastes 4:12, which is often used in marriage sermons as well, which actually I think is somewhat taking it out of real context, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's about the nature of we need support from other people around us. And two people are not enough. You need a third. And we use it in the sense that a marriage is in danger if you don't have Christ in that relationship too. A three-stranded cord is not easily broken. A two-stranded cord comes unraveled very quickly. So obviously for us as Christians, our relationship with the Lord is just foundational in this. And a couple needs to be cultivating that together in their prayer life, to have times to pray together, to reflect on Scripture together. That's always difficult when you have young children, and we weren't very good at it at that time. When your children have left home, it's a whole lot easier to have that sort of discipline. But so these are some of the things, some ideas, hopefully some catalysts to your own thinking, some books to read on this topic.